In this powerful video, we're going to see a discussion that took place between Joe Rogan and Dr. S.D.N.Y. Myers of the Discovery Institute. If you've been paying attention to Joe Rogan, you found out that in another podcast, he's actually confessed he started to go to church. Now, this is really fascinating because when you watch some of his earlier podcasts, his older podcasts, he was an adamant atheist at one time. And then he began to transition to agnosticism. And now he's going to church. Now, does that mean he's a full-blown Christian? I don't know. But it does mean that he's been open to hearing things that he may not necessarily agree with initially. You find that Joe Rogan seems to be listening a lot more than talking. And I think because this is one of the first times he was really confronted with someone who knows this stuff. We're going to take a good look at just this conversation and hone in on a couple key things that took place.
Do you believe in evolution?
I believe in, I believe in microevolution. I believe that there are real evolutionary processes. I'm skeptical about what's called universal common descent, the idea that all living forms have evolved from one single common ancestor. I'm profoundly skeptical about chemical evolution, the idea that the non-living chemicals in a prebiotic ocean or prebiotic soup arrange themselves to form the first living cell. And I'm also skeptical about the creative power of the mutation selection mechanism, which, as it happens, so are many leading evolutionary biologists today. I attended a conference in 2016 convened by the Royal Society in London, the Royal Society being the oldest and most august scientific body in the world. And it was convened by a group of evolutionary biologists who were essentially dissatisfied with neo-Darwinism, the standard textbook theory that we learn in all high school and college textbooks. And many of them were saying we need a new theory of evolution. The first talk at that conference was given by Gerd Müller, a prominent Austrian evolutionary biologist, and he simply enumerated the 5 major what he called explanatory deficits of neo-Darwinism. And his basic perspective was the mutation selection mechanism does a good job of optimizing or modifying pre-existing.
By the way, just a quick advertisement. We actually have an interview with Dr. Jim Torr coming up really soon. So don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel. And Jim, or James as he goes by, really deals with the origin of life theories and just the insurmountable barriers. Let's get back to this video.
Forms. It can generate small-scale variation, but it does a very poor job of explaining the origin of those forms. Think about, for example, Darwin's finch beaks. Great job of explaining how variations in weather patterns result in changes in the shape and structure of the finch beaks. But that mechanism turns out not to do a good job of explaining the origin of birds or other major animal groups in the first place. So modification, yes. Innovation, no.
So modification over massive amounts of time, don't you think that would eventually lead to new groups? Because a lot of new groups have similar origins, or at least origins from one ancestor.
Well, time,
like primates.
Yeah, time was always the.
By the way, you gotta hone in on Joe Rogan's sort of pushback, because S.D.N.Y. Meyer is pointing out that what evolution is fundamentally is just minor changes over time. Now, the macro theory of evolution says, well, if you got a bunch of time, then we can expect to see species change. Let's see how Dr. Myers answers this question.
Hero of the plot, but let me just run a couple of arguments by you, and let's see what you think. Okay, and I developed these in a lot of detail in my book Darwin's Doubt. If we now know, thanks to the genetic revolution, the molecular biological revolution, that if you want to build a new form of life, you have to have new code, because all new forms of life depend upon new anatomical, a fundamentally new type of animal, for example. So you need new anatomical structures but the new anatomical structures require new cell types. New types. So if you got animals that first come online and they have a digestive system, they have a gut. Well, you got to have enzymes that can service a gut, that can process food. So enzymes are types of proteins. Proteins are built from the informational code in DNA. So anytime you want to get it's just like in the computer world. If you want to give your computer a new function, you've got to provide new code. So we have these long digital bit strings, ACs, Gs, and Ts, not zeros and ones, but ACs, Gs, and Ts in a digital string. And we call that a gene. And if you have a section of DNA for building a protein, that's great, it all works. Now, but if you want to build a fundamentally new form of life, you got to have new proteins to service the new cell types to build the new anatomical structures. In our computer world, we know that if you start randomly changing the zeros and ones in a section of digital code, you're going to degrade the function of that code long before you come up with a new string for making a new program or operating system. The functional sequences are they're highly isolated in what's called sequence space. You can change a few things and still retain function, but after a very few number of changes, you're going to degrade the function, and long before you come up with a new function. Now, the Darwinian mechanism starts with the idea that there are random changes in those digital bit strings, those sequences of A's, C's, G's, and T's. And based on our experience in the computer world, we would expect that random changes are going to, again, degrade those strings long before they're capable of building a new protein. And there's now very compelling experimental evidence that that's true. There's an Israeli molecular biologist, Dan Tofik. Unfortunately, he died fairly recently in a tragic accident. But he was doing mutagenesis experiments on sequences of code for building specific proteins that fold it into stable structures. They're actually called protein folds. And he found that between 3 and 15 mutations was enough to degrade the thermodynamic stability of the protein structure that the gene was making. And once you lose that thermodynamic stability, you have no functional possibilities.
Is there possibly an undiscovered mechanism for protecting against that we're not aware of yet?
Possibly, but there's numerous lines of evidence suggesting that mutations are within limits. You can modify again. You can optimize an existing protein structure called a fold. But if you allow too many of those mutations, you're going to degrade. And long before you would get a fundamentally new...
By the way, this is such an important thing to pay attention to, and that is this, that the traditional theory of Darwinism, it was based on, minor changes over long periods of times, and that a series of mutations would lead to an animal or a species transitioning, right? These mutations would be in the favor. But the one thing that Darwinism began to face was that these transitional species were just not around. So individuals like Stephen Jay Gould began to come up with the altered theory of evolution called punctuated equilibrium. In others, there was fast changes over periods of times. That's why we see these jumps and we don't see all these fossils everywhere. But here's the thing. The one thing we understand is that anytime you raise the mutation rate, there is a greater diminishing of advantages in life altogether. We can see this in viruses. We can see this in bacteria. We can actually test this out, that when you raise mutation rates, that there is a corresponding decrease in the life and the advantages that come with those mutations. Really fascinating, and this is what Dr. Myers is honing in on. Let's get back to the video.
Protein structure, another protein fold. So that's just one of many. I want to run one other argument by you that I think is very intuitive. If you want to build, it turns out that there are structures or systems for building that are very important for building new animal body plans. And they're called developmental gene regulatory networks. They were discovered at Caltech by Eric Davidson and colleagues. Eric Davidson has also unfortunately recently passed away in the last few years. But what they discovered is that you not only have genes for building proteins, you have genes that are building that for constructing molecules that send signals that tell the genome when to express other parts of itself. So you've got there's signaling molecules that are telling the genome when to turn this part or that part on in order to build the right proteins at the right time as new cells are going through cell division in the process of animal development. So if you go from 1 cell to 2 to 4 to 8 to 16, etc., you've got to, and as you have a developing animal form, there are points in that trajectory where it's important to differentiate one type of cell from another, and for certain types of cells, muscle cells as opposed to nerve cells or bone cells, to start to be constructed. And all of this is closely choreographed by these signaling molecules. So you get a DNA that builds regulatory RNA that turns on another part of the DNA that then turns on, that builds a protein for servicing a particular type of cell at the right time and not at another time.
We see that Joe Rogan, actually, if you watch the whole video, you can go to the Joe Rogan podcast on YouTube. It's really fascinating. Out of this video, compared to his other videos, he doesn't talk a lot this time. He asks a few questions. He seems to be in a posture of listening. And I think it's probably because he has not encountered someone that has a lot of information and knowledge and wisdom in regards to the evolutionary theory, how to study out cell biology, molecular biology. And so I really appreciate this video because it was one of the times that I begin to see that sort of in Joe Rogan's journey that he came across someone who was knowledgeable about these things. In addition, he was someone who, Stephen Myers is someone who believes in an intelligent designer. He sees design. And I think this is what the Bible tells us, right? Like in the beginning, God, right? We see God as the uncaused cause and the one that's behind all of this. Look, it doesn't matter if you're a skeptic, a seeker, an atheist, or an unbeliever or a believer. You know, when you make the decision to be open to more information, more knowledge, I believe it's an opportunity for God to really speak to your heart and to your mind. Regardless of whatever your background has been or whatever experience you've had with the Christian faith, I really believe that God is calling us, especially in these times, to be open to the things he's communicating to us. You know, there was a skeptic in the Bible by the name of Thomas, adamant. He was upset, and he said after the death of Christ, look, I'm not going to believe in the resurrection of Christ. You guys have told me about the story. Unless I put my finger in his hands, in those wounds, I'm not going to believe that this took place. And then Jesus showed up, you know, in the resurrection to Thomas. And the first words that were out of Thomas's mouth were, "My Lord and my God," which tells us, look, Jesus knows how to deal with skeptics. My name is Hosseinzadeh. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel for more exciting content.